Season 7, Episode 13 of The Curse of Oak Island begins at the recently drained swamp, where the stones which make up the paved wharf are now fully exposed. Tom Nolan, whom Rick Lagina has invited to inspect the formation, says, quote, "Oh, there's no way that's natural. It's like you're standing on a paved road in the middle of a bog," unquote. Later in the episode, Dr. Ian Spooner examines the formation and finds a stick crushed between two rocks. He claims that this indicates that the feature could not have been formed by glaciers, and suggests that the team ought to carbon date the stick if they want to know when the swamp was formed. Later on, Billy Gerhardt, Jack Begley, and Gary Drayton excavate more of the swamp in an effort to define the extent of the paved wharf. The treasure hunters uncover another layer of rocks which they suspect might constitute an extension of the structure despite its lying a foot higher than the paved wharf. In a war room meeting near the beginning of the episode, Rick Lagina and Doug Crowell show their fellow treasure hunters photos of the structures at the Fortress of Louisburg, which they visited in the previous episode. Doug also shows the team an old photo given to him by a Louisburg historian, which depicts a stratum of rocks lying atop a layer of earth. This structure, which Doug says is an original piece of Louisburg flooring, bears remarkable resemblance to the paved wharf. Later in the episode, Rick Lagina, Billy Gerhardt, and Laird Niven travel to the Dartmouth Heritage Museum in Dartmouth, Nova Scotia, where they follow up on the lead introduced by Kevin Rideout in Season 7, Episode 7, indicating that Oak Island's legendary 90-foot stone might lie in the museum's backyard. Despite digging a deep 20-foot by 20-foot hole in the spot at which Rideout believed the stone once lay, the treasure hunters were unable to unearth anything of interest. Later on, Jack Begley and Gary Drayton do some metal detecting around the eye of the swamp. They quickly unearth the iron head of a pickaxe, which Gary suggests might be an old pick used for tunneling. Several feet away, they find what appears to be the rusted head of a round-point shovel. Near the end of the episode, the Fellowship of the Dig meets in the war room to learn the results of the carbon dating of the 106-foot deep wood found in borehole FG-12 in Season 7, Episode 11, which some of the crew members suspected might be a fragment of the original money pit. Craig Tester reveals that the wood was dated from 1626 to 1680, a date range which roughly corresponds with many of the artifacts discovered in the money pit area throughout Season 5. Marty Lagina also remarks that the upper range of the wood's carbon dating is also consistent with that of the twigs which Dr. Ian Spooner and his graduate students discovered in core samples taken from the Eye of the Swamp in Season 7, Episode 9. This new development prompts Gary Drayton and Marty Lagina to wonder aloud what was happening in the area in the late 1600s. The answer is that the Atlantic Northeast was teetering precariously on the precipice of war, namely the 9 Years' War, known as King William's War in Canada and the United States. In the late 1600s, the Nova Scotian peninsula made up the bulk of Acadia, a French colony which stretched from the Kennebec River in what is now the state of Maine to the northernmost tip of what is now Cape Breton Island. To the south of Acadia were the new English colonies of Massachusetts, New Hampshire, Rhode Island, and Connecticut. From 1675 to 1678, New England had been subjected to a series of devastating Algonquin raids, known collectively as King Philip's War, King Philip being the nickname of Chief Metacomet, a powerful leader of the Wampanoag Indians. An eccentric French military officer named Jean-Vincent de Saint-Castin, who lived as a chief among the Abenaki Indians of Acadia, took advantage of the conflict by incentivizing the Wabanaki Confederacy, an alliance of 5 Acadian First Nations with whom France was friendly, to join in the attack against the southerly Englishmen. From 1675 to 1677, the Wabanaki tribes engaged in annual raiding campaigns against the New English settlements, prompting a prominent New English military leader named Richard Waldron to retaliate with a strike on a Mi'kmaq settlement in Acadia. By the time King Philip's War ended in 1678, the English and French colonists on North America's Atlantic coast had grown to resent each other and their respective First Nations allies. One incident which starkly illustrates this sentiment took place in the summer of 1677, when a party of New English settlers captured a couple of Mi'kmaq warriors on a fishing trip off the southern coast of Acadia and brought them back to their village of Marblehead, Massachusetts. When they arrived in town with their captives, the fishermen were mobbed by a throng of furious New English ladies who had lost their fathers, husbands, and sons in the war against the natives. Armed with sticks and stones, the vengeful women set upon the Indian prisoners and attacked any of the fishermen who tried to protect them. Left with little choice, the new Englishmen relinquished their captives and watched in helpless horror as the ladies vented their rage upon them. According to one of the colonists who witnessed the atrocity, quote, "We were kept at such a distance that we could not see the prisoners till they were dead, and then we found them with their heads off and gone, and their flesh in a manner pulled from their bones." Unquote. When King Philip's War finally ended in 1678, the Atlantic Northeast enjoyed 10 years of relative peace, although the New Englanders and the Wabanaki tribesmen neither forgot nor forgave the atrocities that they had suffered at each other's hands. The Abenaki Nation, one of the 5 tribes of the Wabanaki Confederacy, finally broke the spell in early 1688, launching a series of surprise raids against New England. That spring, Edmund Andros, the widely unpopular governor of what was then the Dominion of New England, retaliated by launching a minor raid against Acadia, plundering an Abenaki village situated on the shores of what is now southern Maine. Significantly, this village was the home of Saint Gaston, the French officer turned Indian chief who was away at the time. 4 months later, the New Englanders carried out a second raid against the fishing village of Chedabucto, now Guysborough, Nova Scotia, situated on the northeastern shores of the Acadian Peninsula. The Wabanaki Confederacy countered by raiding the New English villages of New Dartmouth, now Newcastle, Yarmouth, and Kennebunk. While conflict resumed in the Atlantic Northeast, a larger war was brewing across the Atlantic Ocean. France at that time was the world's leading superpower, led by the powerful Catholic monarch Louis XIV. Although King Louis was on friendly terms with King James II of Great Britain, a fellow Catholic ruler, he was feared by much of the rest of Europe. Many suspected that Louis harbored designs to one day rule all of Christendom, and dreaded the balance of power tipping in France's favor. To the east of France lay the Holy Roman Empire, a loose agglomeration of German states of both Catholic and Protestant persuasion, nominally led by the Emperor Leopold I, another Catholic and a member of the House of Habsburg, one of Europe's most powerful noble families. At that time, the Holy Roman Empire was at war with Turkey's Ottoman Empire, and King Louis had done nothing to help his fellow Catholic ruler repel the Islamic incursion. His inaction fostered resentment not only in the emperor, but also in the sickly King Charles II of Spain, another member of the Habsburg family who was plagued by congenital illnesses resultant of the Habsburgs' practice of multi-generational intermarriage. Last but not least of the major political players in Western Europe at that time was the fledgling Dutch Republic, which had, several decades earlier, emerged victorious from an 80-year fight for independence from Habsburg Spain. The Dutch Republic was ruled in part by its stadtholder, the devoutly Protestant Prince William III of Orange, who considered King Louis XIV his arch-enemy. 16 years earlier, while Holland was busy fighting a naval war with England, King Louis had taken advantage of the distraction and marched his army right into the heart of the Dutch Republic, an incident which so enraged the Dutch people that they killed and ate their own prime minister. It had taken the Dutch 6 years to push back the Gallic invaders, and Prince William was determined to never allow the French king to get the better of him again. At that time, the English Parliament, Protestant to a man, was none too pleased with the Catholicism of Britain's King James II. 4 decades prior, zealous English parliamentarians had beheaded James's father, King Charles I, in part because of his pro-Catholic leanings. Rather than repeat the mistake of their predecessors, which led to the bloody English Civil War and the disastrous Commonwealth of England that followed it, the parliamentarians secretly plotted with William III, Prince of Orange, urging the Dutch stadtholder to seize the British crown in a bloodless coup d'etat. William acquiesced. In the winter of 1688, he and 40,000 mercenaries sailed through the Strait of Dover and across the English Channel, disembarked at Torbay, marched on London, and assumed the British throne in what the parliamentarians dubbed the Glorious Revolution. While the Dutch prince was crowned King William III of Great Britain, the deposed King James II fled to France, where he and his descendants became known as the Jacobite Pretenders. While William III had been organizing his invasion of Great Britain, Louis XIV had invaded the western frontier of the Holy Roman Empire, hoping to acquire territory on which he could build defensive fortresses for the purpose of securing the French border. Alarmed by France's military might and Louis XIV's apparent expansionism, William III decided to join forces with his people's old enemies, the Habsburgs, who were now fighting the French on their own doorstep. In 1689, the Dutch Republic, Great Britain, Spain, and the Holy Roman Empire allied to form the League of Augsburg, also known as the Grand Alliance, and promptly declared war on France. Thus, the 9 Years' War, sometimes referred to as King William's War in Canada and the United States, commenced. Back in the Atlantic Northeast, the conflict between French and British colonists and their respective First Nations allies was already in full swing. The first few years of King William's War were characterized by Wabanaki and French-Canadian raids against New English settlements, many of these led by Jean Vincent de Saint-Castin and a French Sulpician missionary named Father Louis-Pierre Thury. In 1690, the New Englanders began to hit back, launching their own counteroffensives into Acadia. The first of these campaigns was led by Benjamin Church, a veteran of King Philip's War who trained his own soldiers in the guerrilla tactics of the East Coast Native Americans, forming his own unit of special light infantrymen who constituted the 1st Regiment of what would one day become the U.S. Army Rangers. Church's first expedition into Acadia culminated in a battle near what is now Portland, Maine. The second New English offensive against Acadia was led by Sir William Phips, a character who features in an interesting Oak Island theory presented by engineers Graham Harris and Les McPhee in their book Oak Island and Its Lost Treasure. William Phips was considered something of a homegrown hero in New England. A low-born shipwright and a lumber merchant from the colony of Massachusetts, he had allowed his hard-won livelihood to literally go up in flames in order to save the lives of the residents of a particular village during a Wabanaki raid that took place during King Philip's War. More recently, he had been awarded a knighthood from King William III for salvaging the contents of a sunken Spanish treasure galleon in the Caribbean, a portion of which Harris and McPhee contend lies at the bottom of the money pit. Despite Phips's complete lack of military experience, the Massachusetts militia promoted him to the rank of Major General in the spring of 1690 and gave him command of the naval expedition against New France. First, Phips launched an attack against Port Royal, the capital of Acadia, situated on the southwestern shores of the Acadian Peninsula. To his delight, Phips found that Port Royal's 90 soldiers were actually in the process of dismantling their fortifications so that stronger ones could be built in their place. None of the fort's cannons are presently functional, and, to top it off, the village's armory housed a total of 19 muskets at that time. The garrison surrendered without a fight. About a month after his capture of Port Royal, Sir William Phips tasked one of his officers with conducting yet another raid on the Acadian village of Chedabucto. In addition to housing a French military post called Fort St. Louis, Chedabucto served as a headquarters of the Company of Acadia, an important French fishing company. On June 3, 1690, Phips's captain and 88 New English soldiers stormed Fort St. Louis. Although they were heavily outnumbered, the 12 Acadian soldiers who manned the fort put up a fierce 6-hour defense. When the New Englanders began to firebomb the fort, the French defenders realized that future resistance would be futile. They surrendered to the New English captain, who allowed them to retreat across the Gulf of St. Lawrence to the French colony of Plaisance on the island of Newfoundland. That fall, Phips launched a third offensive against the French, this one targeting the city of Quebec, the heart of New France. Accompanied by 2,300 Massachusetts militiamen, Phips sailed from Boston up the Atlantic coast and further up the St. Lawrence River. The New English army reached the new French capital on October 16, 1690, whereupon Phips sent an envoy into the city to deliver his terms of surrender. The French commander, Governor Frontenac, had the emissary blindfolded and brought to his residence, the Chateau St. Louis, where his war council was assembled. There, the envoy delivered Phips's terms of surrender, telling Frontenac that he had 1 hour to reply. The enraged governor famously retorted that the only reply Phips would receive would be from the mouths of his cannons. That evening, the New Englanders launched their assault on Quebec. From the very start, it was clear that their enterprise was doomed to fail. Members of the 1,200-man landing party were prevented from disembarking on the wooded shores outside the city by French-Canadian soldiers and First Nations warriors who fired at them from concealment in the trees. Meanwhile, Phips's 3 main warships barraged the city with cannon fire, only to be pounded in turn by Quebec's shore batteries, which exceeded them in firepower. Following a futile attempt to overcome the French shore defenses, the besiegers returned to Boston in defeat. In the years that followed Phips's failed assault on Quebec, a number of battles between the French and English and the respective First Nations allies took place in the borderlands between Acadia and New England. Benjamin Church launched 2 more offensives into what is now Maine. New English sailors made another assault on Port Royal, and French and English mariners engaged in a naval battle in the Bay of Fundy. In 1696, the French and their native allies captured Fort William Henry, a large stone fortress situated near what is now Bristol, Maine, which had been built on the orders of Sir William Phips. The attackers returned up the Atlantic coast and proceeded to destroy nearly every English settlement in Newfoundland. In response, Benjamin Church led a number of brutal raids on Mi'kmaq and Acadian settlements throughout what is now the province of New Brunswick. The 9 Years' War finally ended in 1697, and its belligerents signed the Treaty of Ryswick, a document which, among other things, restored the pre-war borders in North America. Peace would reign in Acadia for another 4 years, until the death of the heirless Spanish king, and the subsequent War of Spanish Succession, but that's a story for another time. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video and would like to help support this channel, please check out my book, The Oak Island Encyclopedia, which you can find by clicking the link in the description.